By the spring of 326 BC, Alexander the Great stood at the banks of the Indus, the edge of the known world. Behind him lay Persia, Babylon, and the mountains of Gandhara. Ahead, the fabled land of the five rivers, the Punjab, rich, mysterious, and defiant. This was no longer conquest for empire, it was conquest for glory. But what Alexander didn't know was that this land would break the spirit of even his invincible army. This is the story of Alexander in the Punjab, a tale of war, philosophy, betrayal, and the limits of ambition. When Alexander reached the Indus, he was greeted not by enemies but by opportunity. Waiting across the river was Ambhi, the ruler of Taxila, a man who saw power shifting westward. Ambhi crossed the river himself, bowing before Alexander with gifts fit for a god: silver, cattle, elephants, and something far more valuable: his allegiance. With Ambhi's alliance, Alexander had his first foothold in India, a kingdom of learning and trade, and a safe base for war. Under his engineers, Alexander built a bridge of boats near Hind. The army, tens of thousands strong, marched across, the air alive with trumpets, commands, and the groaning of wagons. When the last soldier crossed, Alexander sacrificed to the gods and held grand athletic games, a Greek festival on Indian soil. He had crossed not just a river, but a threshold into legend. Taxila stunned the Greeks. It wasn't a fortress, it was a city of thinkers. A place where scholars debated under open skies. Here, Alexander met the gymnosophists, naked philosophers who renounced all possessions. Among them was Calenus, who would later accompany Alexander and shape his view of Indian wisdom. But this was no time for philosophy. East of Taxila stood Porus, king of the land between the Jhelum and Chenab. Tall, proud, and unyielding, Porus was everything Ambhi was not. And as rain clouds gathered, the two greatest commanders of their age prepared to face each other. When Alexander reached the Jhelum river, the monsoon had arrived. The river swelled into a roaring wall of water. Porus camped on the far bank, his elephants standing like towers of war. For weeks, the two armies stared across the storm. Alexander could not cross. Porus would not attack. Then, under a night of thunder and rain, Alexander struck. He marched upstream, silent and unseen, and crossed the river miles away using boats and rafts. At dawn, his men stood behind Porus's army. The trap was sprung. The battle of the Hydaspes that followed was one of the most brutal in ancient history. Porus unleashed his 200 war elephants, their tusks armored with iron. The ground trembled as they charged. Alexander countered with precision, cavalry feints, flanking maneuvers, and disciplined phalanxes. The elephants turned wild, trampling their own men. When Porus's son fell in battle, the Indian lines began to waver. Then Craterus, crossing from behind, completed the encirclement. Porus was defeated, but undefeated in spirit. When Alexander asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, like a king. Impressed, Alexander restored his kingdom, and even expanded it. It was victory, but not conquest. It was respect between warriors. After Hydaspes, Alexander's ambition soared higher than ever. He built two cities, Nicaea, the city of victory, and Bucephala, in honor of his fallen horse. But as he pressed deeper into Punjab, the land fought back. Crossing rivers like the Chenab and Ravi became deadly ordeals. The monsoon drowned men and crushed boats. The tribes resisted with fury. Cities like Sangala fell only after savage fighting. The glory of conquest was fading, replaced by exhaustion. When Alexander finally reached the Bees, the last of the five great rivers, he dreamed of going further, to conquer the mighty Nanda empire of Magadha. But his men had reached their limit. 8 years of war, disease, and endless rain had drained them. When Alexander ordered the crossing, they refused. It was not rebellion, it was despair. For 3 days, Alexander shut himself in his tent. Then, he emerged and gave one of history's most powerful speeches, reminding them of shared glory, danger, and reward. Yet even Alexander's charisma could not move them. His general, Coenus, spoke for all: "We are worn out. We wish to see our homes again." The conqueror had finally met something he could not defeat: the will of his men. In silent resignation, Alexander ordered a retreat and built 12 giant altars to mark the edge of his empire, monuments to both his triumph and his limits. The return was a nightmare. Sailing down the Indus, Alexander's army battled tribes, floods, and disease. When he finally reached the ocean, he believed he had reached the edge of the world, but his army was shattered. The once unstoppable conqueror now led a broken host through the burning Gedrosian desert, losing more men than in all his battles combined. He had come to India as a god. He left it as a man. The Punjab, the land of 5 rivers, had given him victory, but also humility. It was the peak of his empire, and the beginning of his end. Alexander's march through India was more than a conquest, it was a confrontation between worlds, between philosophy and ambition, between man and his own limits. And on the banks of the Bees, history learned, even the greatest conqueror has a boundary he cannot cross. This was Alexander in the Punjab.